Senator Rand Paul has spoke out against the policy of lockdowns and restrictions, declaring that there is no evidence they are having any impact on the spread of coronavirus, and that those who say they do are not paying attention. We ought to at least still use logic to try to figure out how we stop this, Paul said in an appearance on Fox News, adding, I don't see any evidence that crowd control, hand washing, standing 6 feet apart, all of these things they tell you to do, closing down the restaurants, closing down the schools, there's no real evidence that they are changing the trajectory of the disease. Here's Rand Paul speaking on Fox News.
But the thing is we ought to at least still use logic to try to figure out how we stop this. I think ultimately the vaccine will be very successful, but I don't see any evidence that crowd control, hand washing, standing 6 feet apart, all these things they tell you to do, closing down the restaurants, closing down the schools, there's no real evidence that they're changing the trajectory of the disease. If you look at the incidence of COVID, it's going up like this. It's going up exponentially despite all the mandates. So those who say there is science just aren't paying attention to it. Look, this isn't a lack of compassion. I want people to get, the vaccine. I want them to be able to avoid this scourge. But at the same time, keeping all our kids home isn't changing the course of this disease. They've studied this in 4 different countrywide studies. They've studied the incidence of the disease. They've studied the transference of the disease. And they've found that closing schools doesn't work. Even the socialist de Blasio is now opening schools. So now we have our governor in our state closing schools right about the time that everybody else is finally accepting that closing schools isn't working.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit more about that in a moment, but I do want to ask you about the stimulus because, that is obviously such a painful part of this as well, just the financial burden, as you heard from Angela Marsden and the others in that video. There's $455 billion of the already allocated stimulus that has gone unspent. I know you have concerns about that and also about some of where this money has gone.
I think the most important thing is if you want to get people back to work, you can't pay them more not to work than they get for working. Right now, there's about 3.5 million jobs that would be filled immediately if you weren't paying people more not to work. So it's sort of this big heart, small brain syndrome. People say, I want to give people money, they're out of work. But if you give them more than they normally made by working, they'll continue. You institutionalize unemployment. So it's a big mistake to continue unemployment above the normal level. What I would have done all along throughout this is I would have extended unemployment, but I wouldn't have given additional money to those unemployed because it serves as a disincentive to people getting back to work. So more stimulus is just more borrowed money and not good for the country. Right now, you look at the GDP for the last quarter going up at 11%. You look at unemployment at 6%. I saw a statistic today that said we had growth numbers in the job numbers, this last set of job numbers, private job numbers, that were better than 95 out of 96 months of President Obama's term. So we really should be looking at this in a rational way and not saying, let's just print more money and borrow more money. We're getting out of this, and as soon as we get the vaccine, we're going to get out of this in a rapid fashion. And all I would say to government officials is let's get the vaccine out as soon as we can.
Yeah, let's hope, because as you say, you lost someone. There are people all across this country who have lost people that they love. It's a serious disease. I keep going back in my mind to what you said in the beginning. You see that line that's going straight up, and you see across the country, everywhere I go, people wear masks more now than they ever did in the earlier stages of this. And, it just raises the big, curious question about how much we still don't know about this awful virus, Doctor and Senator.
And I think one of the things that, the Supreme Court got right when they made the ruling right before Thanksgiving, they said even during a pandemic, the Constitution isn't to be put away and forgotten, the First Amendment. And the thing is it's not that I'm telling everyone to go to church. I think there are some people in our society where there are dangers to go and sit in church for 2 hours. If you're in your mid-80s and you're listening to this, right, I'm not recommending it. But I'm also telling you that the government shouldn't tell you can't go to church. And the government shouldn't tell you can't send your kids to a religious school. Doesn't mean it's always advisable. With schooling, I think it is. Opening the schools is advisable, and the government, Governor Beshear in my state, interfering with this is an interference of the First Amendment. I think the Supreme Court is going to strike him down very quickly, or they're going to send it back and say, hey, look, we already ruled on this just at Thanksgiving that you can't infringe the First Amendment. But there's good advice, and you can take advice and you can give advice, but once you mandate it, it doesn't become advice. It becomes a form of tyranny. So I think the government should not not be in the form of mandating these things, because sometimes the science isn't clear, and sometimes they change their mind on the science month to month and week to week.
Javier Becerra, his selection as the head of Health and Human Services. What do you think about that, Senator?
You know, I'm concerned about the reports that say that he's been a champion for late-term abortion and at the time of birth abortion, and that's outside the norm. Even pro-choice people a lot of times will say they believe in some restrictions, but to believe in sort of complete unlimited abortion till the time of birth or after, I think is something that's a very radical position, and I would hate to have him in charge of trying to dispense government monies towards that kind of policy. So we'll look long and hard, and I'll try to keep an open mind, but my first impression of what I'm hearing about him is that he may be way outside the mainstream of what anybody in Kentucky would think is right.
You know, just back for a moment to the loss of learning in schools. Very interesting piece today in the Washington Post. A Lost Generation is the title. Surge of research reveals that students are sliding backward. The most vulnerable are the worst affected. You know, I think we're going to be feeling the pangs of this in our society for a very, very long time. All of these kids at home, in front of computers, if they're lucky enough to have one, it's devastating.
What's this education gap? And there's always been an education gap out there based on poverty and lack of education among the parents. But now it's compounded because the kids had a chance. They had an escape. They got to go to a school. And some of them discovered the wonders of learning, and some of them went on to be PhDs and scientists. They're not going to get that if they're at home and they're in a dysfunctional place where their parents are not capable of teaching them. So really, this should be a strong message to teachers that we appreciate you and we think you do a good job. But instead, so many of the teachers unions have reacted and said, hey, no, not me. Yeah. But the evidence is teachers are not dying from this. Kids are not transmitting to them.
Yeah, that's good news.
It isn't an increased danger.
It's good news, and it should be embraced as such. We're in a second, I'm going to talk to the Surgeon General about the vaccines and other issues. But before I let you go, I want to ask you your thoughts. There was a debate last night between Senator Loeffler and Raphael Warnock, the Reverend in Georgia. Your thoughts on this very important race coming up?
You know, I watched the entire debate, and I came away thinking, my goodness, that Raphael Warnock must be a radical liberal. But that point aside, I think there was a distinction, and he really can't escape all of his past statements about either defunding the police or that, you know, you can't serve God in the military. And I think these are statements that do put him out of the mainstream. And I think, you know, I met my wife in Georgia. I worked as an ER doctor in Georgia. I know what Georgians are like, and I just don't know if they're going to want somebody so far out the mainstream, somebody who actually has used the Bible to justify abortion. I don't know what part of the Bible that he's reading, but a lot of that is really outside the mainstream of people who live in Georgia.
Senator Paul, thank you.